All right, welcome to week 9 of our course, where we're going to discuss contract components, contract management, and what happens when a contract ends. Ostensibly, this lecture is the essence of the course because the entire course is supposed to be about contracts. But in order to get to this phase in the process where you have awarded a contract and the vendor is now performing work for the municipality, you have to go through all the other steps we've discussed over the semester. All the building blocks we discussed of writing a complete scope of work, carefully considering all vendors that respond, and negotiating the terms of the contract get you to this point where you have a valid contract and you're ready to work through that with the vendor. On a side note, this used to be my job. I managed the contract that provides garbage, recycling, and bulky item pickup to over 800 apartment complexes across the city. It was a classic service contract every day in the lives of homes and citizens. Multiple truck and dispatchers required constant oversight and assurance that vendor was doing their job. So first we will discuss common contract sections and what they mean. Then we'll review best practices in managing a contract while it's live, and then what happens when it ends. Finally, our special topic this week is construction contracting, so we'll explore how local governments get their facilities built. Okay, so municipalities write their contracts a little differently. Every municipality is just, varies quite a bit. But this is generally what you're going to see in a service contract. I have uploaded a couple example contracts for you, so feel free to open one now and follow along as I introduce each section. All contracts start with some form of statement or declaration section. Next, you'll find definitions for the project, then the body of the contract terms. We'll discuss all those in a minute, but after the contract terms themselves, you'll see signature blocks, which is where the vendor and the various signers from the local government attest to the contract, and then you'll find appendices and exhibits, which often are where the contract officer will put the scope of work, pricing worksheet, and any other documents or wording that fit into the contract terms themselves. Note that the structure is very similar to how the RFPs were set up. General information, definitions, instructions to the vendor, the scope of work, pricing, and any other forms. This is not by mistake, but by design. All right. So on the very first page of the contract, you'll find statements and declarations. This is where the background of the contract and the intent of the parties are stated. These are usually pretty formulaic and consistent across all the contracts from a particular municipality. These are not unique to government contracts either. They're used in pretty much all legal documents like wills and powers of attorney. You'll find these whereas statements. The most important part of the statements and declaration is the statement of document precedence. This indicates which part of the contract takes precedence over the other. For example, the body of the city's contracts takes precedence over any exhibits, including the scope of work. So if anything in the pricing or the scope of work contradicts what's in the body of the contract, that language beats out the other language. So the language in the contract would supersede anything that was in the exhibits or appendices. If the compensation section of the contract says you'll pay the vendor $90,000, but the pricing worksheet says you'll pay them $100,000, the $90,000 will supersede the $100,000. One of the first sections of any contract should be definitions of the key terms and players in the contract. We define everything from city to services to work product. Anything that is used in this contract that requires a specific definition, outside of what you and I would recognize as its everyday definition. As in the RFP, these provide clarity and consistency throughout the document, especially in the scope of work, where there are several service-specific terms. One note about this section: if you go out and find contracts from other municipalities or even other contracts from the city of Charlotte, I found that they don't always include definitions, which I personally find lazy and insufficient. If you don't define the key terms of the contract, like we've discussed several times before, how can you expect the vendor to know exactly what you expect and to hold them to various performance standards? You really can't. I'm pausing now, I have to sneeze. And we're back, and I just noticed when I got up that my cat has joined me yet again. I really have no privacy in this house. So the compensation section defines how the government will pay the service provider. We don't put the actual payment method, which, by the way, is almost always a check or direct deposit. What I mean by compensation is when the vendor will be paid and in what amount. There are some basic pricing types that line up pretty well with the pricing structures we've discussed. Milestone payment plans are when you set certain deadlines for an activity or group of activities to be complete. For example, hold on, I'm gonna sneeze again. Sorry about that. We have an extra cat at the moment, and I think it's overwhelming my allergies. For example, if the contract was for implementation of some kind of software, one milestone might be customization of the software, another might be training all relevant local and government employees. So in this section, you would just say something like, we're going to pay the vendor based on a milestone plan, which is included in such and such exhibit. Time and materials, T&M, is just like we discussed earlier in the semester. Time and materials, so for that type of pricing, you would just say here, the city will pay the vendor for their time and parts as defined in the pricing worksheet. The other common type of pricing is flat fee, or when you just pay the vendor the same amount of money each week, month, or year, whatever the time period is. And also, of course, if it's a short-term project, just like a couple weeks, and you just pay them at the end of it. All right, so terms and conditions. This and the next several slides are some basic contract sections you'll find in almost all municipal contracts. Assignments refers to who holds the risk and liability. And this is less a section name and more a description of several sections that deal with who has the risk. Of course, in local governments, we want to put as much of the risk on the vendor as possible. Ethics is also not really what you would call a section as much as a group of sections. In our contracts, you'll find a section for drug-free workplace, non-discrimination, and other sections that govern the actual behavior of the employees, the vendor's employees. Force majeure basically states that in extraordinary circumstances, the vendor doesn't have to perform. This covers things like hurricanes or earthquakes, or my personal favorite, acts of God, which you'll see in a lot of contracts under the force majeure language. Price adjustments based on consumer price index changes, like fuel and cost of living, are also common parts of contracts. These terms mean that if a huge fluctuation in a relevant market or commodity occurs, the vendor can seek a price adjustment. The most common example of fuel is fuel adjustments for vendors that drive a lot as part of their services. The fuel adjustment clause would say something like, if the price of diesel fuel increases by more than 15% over a 6-month period, the vendor may seek an increase in pricing. So be careful with these sections, because whereas if the price goes up, the vendor can ask for more money, if the price goes down, you can't pay the vendor less usually. So sometimes those sections can kind of come back to bite you. Right to audit is a really important section that allows the government to audit the vendor's records relevant to the services. This is crucial because there are times you'll need to verify that the vendor performed or that it used all the money paid for the services in the correct way. Term refers to the length of the contract. Every procurement office has their preferred length of contracts. Ours is 3 years plus 2 one-year renewals for a total of 5 potential years if the contract services are ongoing. So it's not like a set project. Of course, if the project the vendor is performing is only 6 months or 6 weeks or, a couple of weeks here and there, then that's going to be the term of your contract if it's not like an ongoing service. Termination can take many forms. You usually start with convenience, which benefits the government the most because basically you can terminate whenever you want or need to terminate the contract, even if the vendor isn't doing poorly. They're just doing okay. So we like termination for convenience. That's really the best kind. Termination for default means that the government can only cancel the contract if the vendor is doing very badly, and the government can prove they're doing badly, which is the kicker. Non-appropriation of funds is a fancy way of saying that if the governing board decides not to fund a certain service that's covered by the contract can be terminated with no fault on each side. This is a little redundant because sorry, I gotta scroll down here. Because most governments choose to allow termination without cause, meaning they can cancel their contracts at any time, but still like to leave it in, just by preference. The difference between the termination clauses is really important because it governs when and how the contract can be terminated, other than the expiration date. If you only have non-appropriation of funds, that means you can't terminate the contract unless funds are cut. So it kind of ties your hands. So it's good to have a mix of termination type languages, or termination clauses. Termination for convenience, like I said, is the best to keep in the contract if you can. Sometimes vendors really want you to negotiate that out. All right, liquidated damages. This is a very widely misunderstood section. You may have heard this in other classes as a way to punish the service provider, which in a way it does. However, the actual point of liquidated damages is to quantify how much it costs and reimburse the municipality for correcting an instance of when the service provider doesn't perform the work well. For example, for the contract I manage, this could be the vendor not emptying a dumpster. If we got a complaint from 311 that a dumpster wasn't emptied, I had to send my field employee out to verify it wasn't empty, contact the vendor to send their truck back out, and then recheck the next day to make sure it was emptied. So that's 15 to 30 minutes of my time and an hour or two of my field employee's time, and that's assuming the dumpster was emptied after we contacted the vendor. For that type of poor performance, we would charge the vendor $25. But there were other levels like repeated missed pickups or whole route incompletion. So yes, this is a way that the municipality can encourage the service provider to perform at a high level, but it's supposed to actually compensate the government for having to deal with any kind of poor performance. All right, confidentiality, security. Service providers are expected and required to keep the data they come in contact with during their contract confidential and secure. Many consultants may learn things about employees or the organization itself that they are required to keep confidential, and such contracts should include a confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement that the vendor's employee must sign before they begin work. Physical security could be anything from security guards at the facilities to agreeing to drug-free workplace requirements or OSHA standards. All right, so changes are often needed to a contract throughout the term. There are two types of documents that can change or affect the contract document, and we outline those in the contract, so you list them and you describe them. One is amendments. Amendments change some or part of the contract, and if a vendor asks for and the government grants a price increase, that might be incorporated via an addendum. At the end of the initial term of the contract, which we'll talk about in a second, and if the government wants to extend for the first optional or the second optional renewal year, the change document is what we call a renewal. And for all these documents, both the vendor and the local government must sign in order for the document to be binding. All right, notices or principal contacts. That section defines at the local government and at the vendor, who at the local government and who at the vendor gets notified if anything significant occurs in relation to the contract. For the city, this is the director of the procurement division and the city attorney. They would get notified by the court if a vendor, for example, files for bankruptcy or is otherwise going to have to close their doors. And, you know, that seems really far-fetched, but we actually had this happen last year to one of our vendors. And at the company, it's whomever needs to be notified when the contract needs to be renewed or adjusted. All right, indemnification. This is a really complicated section, but required by most states of local governments. Basically, it says that if something horrible goes wrong, the city won't admit fault right off the bat, and the vendor will have to hold its employees responsible for any poor performance. All right, insurance portion of the contract dictates what type of insurance coverage the vendor is required to have. Almost all companies are required to have general liability, which covers the company in case anything bad happens that is non-specific. Automobile coverage includes their employees that drive vehicles as part of their job, so if they get into an accident, they won't hold the government liable. Errors and omissions insurance is used for like consultants and law firms that are actually providing their advice as part of the services. And workers' compensation, you're probably familiar with, it covers if any employee gets hurt. So this section of the contract is really, really important because if anything happens and the service provider isn't adequately covered, the city might have to take up the slack on the coverage. All right, reporting covers what kind of reports, updates, or feedback the government requires from the vendor. This can also be in the scope of work, but sometimes you'll find it in the contract itself. Progress reports typically are used during ramp-up or implementation, and they're helpful because they tell you how you're doing in preparation for service delivery. Project reports are for a while the services are actually ongoing and are often submitted along with invoices. So everything we've discussed so far would really usually be in the body of the contract, but the exhibits have the real information about the specific project that's going on. The scope of work is often incorporated as an exhibit as well as the pricing receipt. You'll also often find things like forms the vendor has to fill out while they're conducting the services. For example, a mechanic type vendor might be required to fill out a service form on each vehicle they repair, and that form might be included as an exhibit. Also, you'll find lists of addresses or locations the vendor is responsible for attached as an appendix. So that ends the first video, and tune back in for part 2 in a minute.